Welcome to the Indie Fantasy Club, where today we'll be diving into Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill. This is the first book in a series of 5, I believe, and I do think there are some other novellas that are part of this universe that aren't necessarily part of the series. It's had a lot of success. It's about, I'd say, maybe 175,000 words, 200,000 words, somewhere in there. It's written in third-person POV with multiple character perspectives, but mostly following one character as the main protagonist named Kaelin. So without further ado, a new world awaits. If I had to describe this book, I think it would be a cross between Malice by John Gwynne and Eragon by Christopher Paolini. The story has elements of the reluctant hero, the chosen one, a coming-of-age story, and it really starts with just 3 young friends who are just at the beginning of their adulthood, and they're really just thrown into this conflict that takes them all over the continent. Along their journey, they discover that magic is real and how destiny has chosen them to free the world from centuries of tyrannical rule. Like I said earlier, the book mostly follows Kaelin, who is our main protagonist, but there are occasionally other POVs from other characters throughout the story. But since they're so minor, you don't really get too much of them. I probably won't touch on them too much in this review. But like I said, Kaelin is a young man. He's in the process of becoming a man as he participates in a village ritual of running into the forest to survive for a few days on his own. They have to come back with a kill to prove they're able to survive and provide. Honestly, sometimes I wish things were that simple in my own life, except I probably wouldn't survive, so maybe not. Anyway, he goes with his best friends, Rist and Dan. They're able to travel in a group, and they return as men with plenty of stories to tell. But it's not long after that they run into Empire soldiers that essentially changes their lives forever. I don't want to spoil too much more than that, but it is very much in the epic fantasy realm. You'll get some magic, you'll get some battles, you'll get a little bit of romance, and plenty of suffering. So if you like that kind of thing, this book will probably have some appeal for you. So with that context in mind, let's dive into the indie review. The first up is Immersion and Worldbuilding, which I have to give a 6.5 out of 10. And here's why. This book does do a pretty good job of establishing the history and lore of Etheria. It does give you a pretty good idea of how this empire basically came to power and the reasons why they essentially should be overthrown. And it does fold in different races like giants and elves in a very mysterious yet organic way that just makes it feel very natural to the world that we're in. It's funny because my last review was The Sword of Kaigan, and I briefly mentioned breadth versus depth. Now, where The Sword of Kaigan had depth, and it was focused on a really small village pretty much the entire time, Of Blood and Fire has more breadth, but it doesn't quite go as deep for me. It kind of seemed like we touched on a lot of things very shallowly as we kind of moved forward in the story. You travel through multiple towns and cities, meet plenty of new characters, and have plenty of conflict. My issue is that everything is happening so fast in this book that I almost don't feel as much of a connection as everything is just streaming past me as I'm reading. Like, we're just cruising through this pacing in this story, which just made it so that I didn't feel as connected or grounded to the events or the characters. I felt like a rock skipping across the top of a lake when really all I wanted to do was just to slow down and kind of sink into the depths and really get a feel for what this world had to offer. And that's definitely a preference of mine. So if you like really fast-paced stories, you'll probably like this story a lot. For me, I like to just be able to slow down a little bit and really be emotionally connected to everything before major events start to happen. Then I really can get that emotional payoff. And don't get me wrong, I don't always like long character descriptions or characters that are wallowing in their sorrow for chapters and chapters on end. But it is nice to have some of that balance as part of the story, rather than just briefly touching on these emotions as they're getting moved through the events of the book. So if you do like fast-paced stories that don't really get bogged down in as much description or depth of emotion or that internal monologue that some of the characters do, you'll probably like this book because it is very fast-paced and it doesn't have as much, in my opinion, of that deep internal conflict. And that leads me to the names or the characters, which for me gets a 4.5 out of 10. Man, I really wanted to like these characters. I liked the storyline. I liked the idea, the concept, but they just, like I said, they just felt a little too shallow for me. They didn't feel as explored in the potential that these characters had. The decisions and the dialogue to me seemed like it was driven almost entirely by plot and tropes instead of authentic character reactions and communication. And it got to the point where deaths would happen, important character deaths would take place, and I just didn't feel myself caring about those events. And I know that I do care about those things because in books like Malice, when deaths happen, they are visceral and they really tug at you. You feel that just loss as you're reading the story. So I have felt that before with traditionally published books, and this one I just think fell short of that deep emotional connection with the characters. We brushed through the story so quickly, I just couldn't bring myself to care when these people died, and I feel bad about that, but that's just the truth of the matter. Now, with that said, I didn't hate these characters. That's why they get a 4 and not a 1, but I just honestly feel like he could have done so much more with these characters if he had just slowed down a little bit and really just let us experience the emotions. I personally needed way more internal conflict, way more internal dialogue where we can see the reasons these people have emotional ties to things, and I really wish we could have explored that deeper rather than so many external forces which just drove the story forward. Now, on a better note, let's talk about the magic and the creatures, which for me gets an 8 out of 10. Like many fantasy readers, I'm a sucker for dragons and dragon riders and dragon stories. So it's almost a gimmick, but you pretty much will catch my attention if you have a dragon in your story. It's just how it is for me. But on top of dragons, there are also other creatures that I found really interesting. The giants, the elves, Fades, Uraks, Drayleads, they were all just a lot of fun to read about. The magic itself does have a little bit of a softer feel, where it does explain how these characters are able to access and use the magic system, but it's not like a Mistborn level of detail and logic and consequences, and it is more elemental, with the magic corresponding to fire, earth, water, air, and spirit. It doesn't really explain how the magic works most of the time. It just kind of brushes through it. And it's because this magic is being discovered right now, so I don't expect a ton of explanation. These characters don't really have a firm grasp or understanding of how magic works, so it is being explained to them little by little. So I would expect maybe more of a hard system or more explanation of how the magic works in later books, but in this one particular, just had that softer vibe to it. But I'm also one of those people that actually likes soft magic systems. I know that a lot of fantasy readers, since the emergence of Brandon Sanderson, are more hard magic fans, but for me, I like a good soft magic system. I'm okay not understanding anything. Half the time, I'm not even smart enough to understand what Brandon Sanderson is explaining, even though he explains it really well. I like soft magic because it makes me feel like I don't have to go to science class to know how magic is working. The infrastructure and plot, for me, gets a 7 out of 10 because it does follow the conventional flow of a fantasy epic. And it does check all of the boxes, in a sense. We have the inciting incident with the proving. We have the mentors and the enemies creating that rising action. There's suspense that leads to a climax. And it does end with a satisfying conclusion that leads into the next book. On paper, it meets all the marks and expectations of a great story. But again, I think this story really would have benefited from just slowing down and spending a little bit more time with the characters. Like, basically, if you cut this book in half and found a way to stretch this half to fill the same word count, I think that would have been a much better book for me personally, because we would have really been able to explore these characters, been able to wrestle with their decisions with them a little bit more, rather than just like the quick decisions that they're making throughout. Because again, a lot happens in this book, but I just would have had more of a connection if we had slowed down. And I feel like there's so much that happens, you can really make a full-sized book out of half of what this guy's written, which I think in and of itself takes a lot of talent to be able to think of this many ideas, think of these many plot points to drive the story forward. Obviously, he has talent and is able to write a really good story. It's just, for me, it's a personal preference that I would rather spend more time with the characters rather than rushing through a lot of the plot aspects. At the same time, I feel like I understand the fears that authors have with that, especially in the indie realm. Like when I first read Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss and The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, both of those books, I was getting back into fantasy, And I had heard that these were highly recommended books by a lot of booktubers. And so I felt like it was a safe bet. So when I went to pick it up and start reading it, I felt like an outlier where I had a really hard time liking both of these books because I was not prepared for the depth of the world building and the character development of these stories. So you're 200 pages into these books and nothing has really happened. In fact, with the Name of the Wind, I did put Name of the Wind down for months because I was like, nothing is happening in this book. It's boring. It wasn't until I got on a flight and I knew I was going to be on this flight for hours that I'm like, I'm just going to bring this book and try and get through it. And now Name of the Wind is one of my favorite books of all time. So there is a risk with spending more time developing the characters and really diving deeper into the emotional connection, because a lot of fantasy readers like me that maybe aren't prepared for something like that will not give it a chance or might get bored and might put it down. You do run that risk when you choose to develop characters in a deep way and choose to develop your world in a slower pace. But I personally think the payoff for that is so much greater. And now that I understand that as a reader, I am way more patient with fantasy books than I was a couple years ago. Keep that in mind, where I don't necessarily hold this against indie fantasy authors that are trying to hook readers, especially if they're debut authors and they're trying to get their name out there. It's just hard to gain the trust of readers when you're new, and especially as an indie author. I can understand the logic behind, I'm just going to really make sure this book moves quickly. We're going to hustle through this plot and make sure we hit all these points that these readers are wanting and expecting. So I don't hold that against Ryan for formatting it that way, but I do think that it's about what risk you want to take. Do you want to take a risk that some people might not get as involved in your story, but those that do become diehard fans because of the deep emotional payoffs that there are? Or do you want kind of just to have smaller payoffs and have a broader audience? But I don't know, I don't feel like there are as many diehard fans of Bound and Broken series that there are for some of these other books. There's going to be loyal fan bases for both camps, but that's just my opinion. Now, this brings me to my overall enjoyment of the book, which for me gets a 5 out of 10. Keep in mind that this is purely my opinion, so it holds the least substantial weight in all of the rankings. The book wasn't bad, it just wasn't one of those books that kept me glued to the pages. It was mid to me. Now, that doesn't mean I won't pick up the next book in the series. As a matter of fact, I plan to at some point, because I'm sure that Ryan's writing has only improved since his first book. That's one of these things I'm kind of looking forward to with these indie reviews, is just seeing the progress and the development of these indie authors. Not a bad score for the first book in the Bound and the Broken series of Blood and Fire, which gets a solid 6.2 out of 10. Like I said in the beginning, if you're a fan of John Gwynn's work or the Eragon series, this series might scratch that itch for you. Though I felt like it lacked a little bit of depth, it still had an interesting premise and overall story with these characters. Now, before it goes on the shelf, let's take a moment to appreciate the artwork and design of this book. I like this cover a lot. I think it's simple, it's clean, it has that aura that I'm looking for. The map is excellent, very legible and clean, while illustrative of the vastness of Etheria, this country. This is great because you do have to reference the journey and locations of the characters multiple times throughout the story, so it is nice to have an idea and have just a clear map to know where these events are taking place. I always appreciate that. The chapter headings also have fun little artwork on them, which I always think is a nice touch. I think it just shows that you care about the layout and the formatting of your book, and it's just one more thing to show that these indie authors really do put that time and effort into these stories that they write. I think it just shows that level of professionalism that we get from traditional publishing, so I can really appreciate that. And as a rare treat for indie fantasy readers, we do also get a couple of illustrations in the book, which I always like the illustrations in books. You'll never find me complaining about those things. So if you're able to put illustrations, I know that it can be expensive and those types of things, but I think it does add a nice little touch, a nice little experience for the readers. So I can appreciate that. That was a nice little bonus. Okay, let's get this bad boy added to the shelf. It is going to be a spine, not a face, but I am looking forward to when one of you indie authors do hit that 9 or higher, so I can put a cover-facing book on that shelf. It'll be an exciting day. For those who have read the full Bound and the Broken series, let me know in the comments what you think of the series. I know Ryan is wrapping up the series, so is it worth continuing and finishing? Let me know. And do you think I'm off with any of my indie rankings? Please tell me that as well. I would love to get your feedback and opinions, even though these are my opinions, so I don't feel like I'm wrong. I would love to get other perspectives of how you felt as you experienced these novels. I've got a list of indie fantasy books that I'm working through right now, but let me know what authors and books you want to see on the list. As always, be sure to join the club so you don't miss out on any indie reviews. And I'll see you in the next one.